Slama vječnim, rasti i cvijetaj, zemljo radnih ljudi. I neka mir nad tvojim ljudima vlada, mir tvojim lađama napuči i tvome danu što se vedar budi. Rasti sretna da svi narodi vide, sa strana svih, sa juga i sjevera, kako se rađa i kako se voli, kako se brani zemlja proletera. Rasti cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Rasti cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Sreći u vodi i u zraku, u pjesmi strojeva i u sjaju žita. Rasti i cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Rasti i cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, самых окраин, с южных гор до северных морей. Человек проходит как хозяин необъятной родины своей. Тут жизнь невольна и широка, точно Волга полная течет. Молодым везде у нас дорога, старикам везде у нас почет. Страна моя родная, слава ей, повторили вы. Я другой такой страны не знаю, мне такой на тысячу лет. Я другой такой страны не знаю, мне такой на тысячу лет. За столом никто у нас не лишний, по заслугам каждый награжден. Золотыми буквами мы пишем всенародный сталинский закон. Этих слов величие и славу никакие годы не сотрут. Человек всегда имеет право на учение, отдых и на труд. Страна моя родная, слава ей, повторили. Я другой такой страны не знаю, я такой на тысячу лет. Я другой такой страны не знаю, я такой на тысячу лет. Над страной весенний ветер веет, каждым днем все радостнее жить. И никто на свете не умеет лучше нас смеяться и любить. Но сурово брови мы насупим, если враг захочет нас сломать. Как невесту родину мы любим, бережем, как ласковую мать. Страна моя родная, слава ей, повторили. Я другой такой страны не знаю, я такой на тысячу лет. Я другой такой страны не знаю, я такой на тысячу лет. ce știm noi din vremuri strămoșești, cuvânt de dor și luptă, de doine și povești. Dar dacă astăzi pacea e lege și sfut, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut. Le-am moștenit în grai, doar bănuiam ce înseamnă, ce tâlcuri au sub strai. Dar dacă astăzi tâlcul de plin l-am priceput, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut.
Greetings, everybody, and welcome along. It is the evening of the 26th of October 2024, and we come to you with a live stream tonight focused on the events in Ukraine and specifically on the PR war versus the real war, and how the figure of Zelensky embodies the PR war and what this means and has meant in terms of the various tactics that have been pursued by the U.S. side. Of course, using Ukrainians as the meat in this particular grinder. Now, why I titled the episode this way was because it's really part of what I see as our ongoing exploration as to the psychological games and operations of imperialism. And what I mean by that is it is very important for US imperialism to project an aura of absolute invincibility, even though, of course, this has never been true. It is important for them, vitally important, that their opponents believe that they can never be beaten. They believe that the US imperialism and the imperialist system more broadly, but of course the US is the head of the snake here, can never lose, that you can never hope to be victorious over it. It's very important for all of the enemies of the US ruling class to be made to believe that, be that the domestic working class, who are, of course, put through an education system and a cultural machine in the US, as we are here in Britain as well, that trains you into thinking that no amount of action by the working class can ever beat the ruling class. You can never overthrow them. There's always been a ruling class, and there always will be. And the workers not only cannot rule right now, but will never be able to. It is a training in cynicism and nihilism and self-doubt. And that's very deliberately cultivated within the working class. Now, you take it more broadly and you look at the nations that are the subjects of the various different machinations of US imperialism. And the same thing applies there, but to the leaderships of national liberation struggles or of communist parties or of social democracies, social democratic parties. Same trick is played. Especially on the leadership, both the leadership and the masses, but I think the psychological operation here is particularly applied to the leaders, who have to be made to believe, or have to be led to believe, or encouraged in the belief that there can never be any hope of winning if the US is against you. And this is something which they try to drum into leaders, and they try to drum it into populations by, as we have seen via the US's actions in West Asia, the mass killing of huge numbers of civilians who are who cannot possibly be argued are what you would call legitimate military targets. It's deliberate mass killing of a civilian population designed only to psychologically break that population and make them believe that they could never win. Now, this is very important when we go back to consider the frequent topic of discussion here, which is, of course, the paper tiger nature of imperialism. Looks ferocious, and indeed can be so, but ultimately can be defeated by the right combination of leadership and the unification in action of the masses. Now, this is something which Mao explained over and over again. It's also in different wording. It's there also in Lenin and Stalin, and also Castro, and also Che. Now, Che, of course, plays a role in this story because it was the overthrow of Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala when Che was there as part of his tour around Southern and Central America that pushed him in the direction of communism, of becoming a Marxist-Leninist. And Castro was also, of course, traveling around Central America and also observed plenty of coups and machinations of US imperialism, and it had a similarly radicalizing effect on him. Now, one of the things that's observed, and this is found in Guevara's own writings, it's also observed in, I believe, the mammoth biography of Che by the American writer John Lee Anderson. Now, I know that John Lee Anderson has a somewhat, shall we say, checkered record when it comes to politics, but I found his biography of Che to be very well researched and contained an awful lot of very interesting details, which it's very much worth reading. It's a very well written book as well. Once you start it, you really can't put it down. But the Anderson notes in his biography of Che, and it's there in Che's own diaries, about how he observes the weakness and the dithering of the Arbenz government leads to its own fall. And when we investigate the reasons as to why, I mean, part of the reasons why it fell wasn't that the US staged a direct invasion against them. They were supporting a ragtag bunch of coup plotters who were running like an army that even the US's own senior intelligence men observed wasn't much good. And in fact, Arbenz's, or forces loyal to Arbenz, won the initial encounters against this army. But the US was playing, of course, psychological games against the Guatemalans, and the big game that they were playing was to convince them that a US invasion or some kind of direct US intervention was on the cards. And Arbenz and the other leaders became convinced that they could not possibly win, because the US was going to intervene, and therefore the best thing to do was to basically resign and get out while the going was still, well, relatively good. And they didn't follow the suggestion of the communists at the time and mobilize the masses. Essentially, Arbenz quit the scene when the CIA-sponsored rebel army hadn't really won any victories. They'd made a lot of noise. They ran a lot of propaganda that was, I believe, recorded in Miami and then broadcast into Guatemala. But the big victory there was a psychological one, principally. The Arbenz leadership just simply didn't. They believed that full-scale intervention from U.S. imperialism was coming, and that wasn't something that they could oppose. And they weren't prepared to take the revolutionary step of mobilizing the masses, arming, training, mobilizing the masses in defense of the Arbenz land reform program, which is, of course, what the overthrow was really all about. And you find this mentality popping up over and over again, especially after, really after 1956. And this is of course, partly a symptom of the Khrushchev and the so-called secret speech, slamming the door on the revolutionary period and declaring it all to be a horrific crime. And that loss of confidence, deliberately instilled loss of confidence, I think, slowly erodes much of the international communist movement, certainly in the West. And not only did it come to be that they regarded revolution as a series of horrible crimes that couldn't possibly be engaged in, but also they became convinced that not only could capitalism not be beaten, but that it shouldn't be. And it's not just a matter of fear, it's a matter of becoming convinced that your opponent is literally unbeatable, that the struggle is not worth the sacrifice. That is the other side of it. Now, what is all this? How does all this have relevance when it comes to Ukraine, when it comes to what I call the PR war and the real war? It's relevant for a couple of reasons. Firstly, the belief by the hierarchy in Ukraine, or at least some of them, going all the way back to the Orange Revolution of 2004, not just the hired intellectuals of the West, but others too, Ukrainian liberals, etc., become completely convinced that the West was unbeatable, that the West could not, that everything perfect for them was in the West, that if the West came, then that dastardly old Putin would be chased away, the Russians would be chased away, the unfavored local oligarchies would be chased away. The West was this immortal thing. And we've spoken here on this channel before about that and about how sad it is that so many people came to believe that. But the principal responsibility is as to why so many, not just in Ukraine, but the rest of the other old people's democracies, Bulgaria, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, the once and future Yugoslavia, all came to believe that literally to construct a very annoying rhyme, West is best. This all, of course, came from US propaganda, but it also came from internally. It came from the leaderships of the communist and socialist parties themselves. Before the early 80s, it was a sort of tacit approval of the idea that the US could never be beaten because they'd given up on the idea of revolution. But also, especially after the early 80s, especially in the Soviet Union, it became positively included in the state media, run by, of course, that foul, repugnant rat Yakovlev, arguing that basically communism, socialism was finished, workers' struggle was finished, the only way was capitalism. And that was what official media in the Soviet Union was turned into. So to a certain extent, the belief in the immortality of the West is something that was instilled into certain elements within the population by the former so-called communist rulers, by the former communist hierarchy in Ukraine and in the wider Soviet Union. So is it then any surprise that after years of being told that by the authorities in the old USSR, that so many in Ukraine came to believe it? And so that's one delusion, the idea that if the West just does lift its finger, that somehow an immense amount of wealth will flow your way. Now, it might flow the way of Zelensky and his friends, but it's certainly not flowing into the bank accounts of most Ukrainians. And of course, it must be said that this idea of Western supremacy, it is bought into by significant numbers of the former Soviet and Eastern European people's democracies in terms of their populations. But it's by no means bought into by everybody. There's always been at least a very sizable minority, if not more, in each country that has persistently and stubbornly rejected this. It tends to be more the middle class types, and more specifically the middle class youth and the intelligentsia, so-called, who buy into this. Incidentally, this was something that Dostoevsky was mocking in his own deeply psychological and reactionary way, all the way back in The Brothers Karamazov, in a certain sense, when it comes to Russia. So, moving then to the second point here. So the first point about the immortality of the West is the convincing of the intelligentsia and certain sections of the population that the West is this immortal thing, immortal creation of immense and unlimited wealth, which of course is them swallowing the propaganda, but swallowing it for very explainable reasons. The other part of the belief in the immortality of the West is the belief in, and again, this is a wholly unjustified belief, in Western military supremacy. And this is something which is a complete concoction. Whereas, of course, you can argue in a concrete sense that US imperialism, in its more productive period, did generate an awful lot of wealth out of its spectacular industrialization and manufacturing boom. Now, that was possible to argue, but the idea of Western military supremacy is really based on a series of myths, absolute myths. You look at the actual triumphs, so-called, of the Western armies over the last 200 years. What are they really? I mean, the biggest victory that the British can claim is not World War I or World War II. It's probably the Napoleonic Wars, which they, mainly through usage of cunning systems of alliances, inside continental Europe and usage of naval power, the British were able to beat the Napoleonic armies. And again, not by no means on their own, but it was really probably the high point of British military power. After that, throughout the 19th century, it's a series of principally colonial actions and small clashes. And of course, you've got the Crimean War in there. You've got certain colonial actions, but really it's a matter of imperial expansion. And so the idea that the British being supreme was something which was, again, rooted in the defeat of Napoleon. But we should remember that before that, of course, the British had been beaten by the American Revolutionary Forces. But the British military supremacy is largely a concoction. It comes from them fighting essentially colonial wars against technologically underdeveloped peoples and slaughtering large numbers of them. And then when we get into World War One, it's a relentless grind commanded by incompetent officers and sends hundreds of thousands of men to die. And they win it basically because their naval blockade finally paid off, and Germany ran out of resources and started to implode. That, and of course the influence of the Bolshevik Revolution, meant that all of the countries involved started to become more and more unstable. And Germany, being the worst affected by the war and the blockade, was the first to fall. The British and the French might have followed them had it gone on much longer. The point here is the idea that the British are this sort of great, unbeatable military force, it just simply isn't true. What's it based on? The victory in the Napoleonic War, okay, that was real. But again, that was largely based on naval power and them slowly choking the French off over many, many years. And of course, we should remember that the principal military disaster on the ground for Napoleon wasn't inflicted upon him by the British, it was inflicted upon him by the Russians in the War of 1812. Now, of course, the British military historians, I'm sure, would argue that the Peninsular War was also very important, and indeed it was. It did represent a strategic victory for the British under the command of Wellesley, Arthur Wellesley, Duke of Wellington. And the Duke of Wellington, let's give him the old bastard his due, was actually a skilled military commander. A complete bastard, as I said earlier, but a man of some considerable military skill on the battlefield. He was a completely inept politician, though, as he later became prime minister. Now, that was a legitimate win, but after that, colonial wars, we had the war against the Russians in Crimea, which was a nominal victory, but didn't really stop the expansion of the Tsardom into aiding the liberation of Bulgaria and dismantling disintegrating Ottoman power around the Black Sea. And again, you get into a serious war, and the British just end up sending hundreds of thousands of their own men to die horribly. And what about the other great British military triumphs in the 19th century? Well, they just about managed to beat the Indian forces in the First Indian War of Independence, but that was a close-run thing. And that was mainly due to division within the Indian independence forces. So it's, again, like this idea of the British being immortal is a self-created myth. Like, it's based on a series of colonial wars and essentially making a naval blockade work out well for them in World War One. Had it gone on much longer, the British would have been in almost as desperate as straits as the Germans, and would have faced potential internal revolt like the Germans did. The French were already facing it. So again, got lucky there. And in World War II, well, the British fought primarily to retain their colonial possessions in the Middle East, or West Asia if you prefer. Again, we know, we've covered this many times, the bulk of the fighting in World War II was done by the Soviets and the Chinese, bulk of the fighting and the bulk of the dying. After World War II, what's the great record of the British military then? Killing large numbers of people in Malaya and Kenya, and then scuttling out of both countries. Fighting a losing battle for many years against the Irish Republicans. and having to basically cobble together a deal with the Sinn Féin leadership in the end, which essentially conceded a few things but kept British control over the occupied 6 counties. So they won a temporary victory at the negotiating table that they couldn't win in battle with the Irish Republican movement. And, well, what else have they done? The Falklands War, just about managed to get away with beating an army of unwilling conscripts from a military regime that was already falling to pieces. Again, this isn't like a world-beating record here. The US's record is no better, no matter what various military experts say about the amazing nature of the Gulf War in 1991. Like, if the most advanced at that time industrialized power in the world, and this was, of course, during the period of the collapse of the USSR and the counter-revolution, couldn't beat Saddam Hussein's Iraq, Ba'athist Iraq, then with not just themselves, but with most of the armies of Western Europe and significant numbers of armies from West Asia as well on their side, then really they had no business being an imperialist power in the first place. And then what else do you have? You have the brutalization of the Serbs in the former Yugoslavia. You have the Kosovo War. You have the Iraq War with a country that had been starved and put under a state of siege for 10 years. So what's the record? The record isn't great. When you actually break it down and look at it, the sheen that the British and the American militaries carried for a long time is carried on the backs of a myth about World War II and an even bigger myth about the Gulf War of 1990 to 1991. The rest of it is myth making and bullshit and deliberately ignoring all of the defeats that were inflicted on both the British and the United States. And again, like, we should probably do a deep dive on the war for the Malvinas, because I'm pretty convinced that the British came fairly close to losing that, much closer than they've ever admitted to. So we'll have to put that one down for a dive into it if we can find an even remotely honest series of sources I can use to research further into the military side of it. Now, the point about all of this is, and the reason why we've gone on this digression into military supremacy, is that, again, to the mythology about the Western armies. And again, we can throw in the French into this as well. What's the French military record? Now, of course, I'm not just going to make the jokes here that every British man of a certain generation used to make about the French army, but let's look at the record. Beaten in Vietnam, beaten in Algeria, again, at great cost to the civilian populations there. Fought a series of brutal and bloody colonial counterinsurgency wars. Just about managed to hang on to the CFA franc area until now, and now they're scuttling out whilst trying to cling on by backing jihadist proxy forces. So again, French military record, garbage. German military record, haven't done anything really since World War II, though of course they remain an imperialist power. Italian military record, same. Spanish military record, well, fascist forces brutalizing their own population, that's their record in the last century. Turkish military record. Let's have a look at that. They're another NATO country. Even though, of course, Erdogan has been very careful to keep them out of the Ukraine war. Like, what's the Turkish army principally been used for? Insurgency work. Principally, the Turkish military has been used on its own population to kill, physically annihilate the Turkish various Turkish communist parties and guerrilla movements, and of course the Kurdish movements. So again, like this whole thing that people in Ukraine, a certain number of people in Ukraine, bought into, this idea that if the West just showed up, everything would fall into place. If the 101st Airborne just landed at Gostomel Air Base, just outside of Kiev, the Russians would shit their pants and run away. This is all nonsense. This is all absolute nonsense. And again, like, we all grow up with it. I mean, I'm not trying to shame anybody here. Like, I grew up in like the late 80s, early 90s, watching like all the war movies. watching all the British like World War II stuff, reading all the old comic books about British heroism, pipe smoking heroes fighting a brave campaign against the Nazis, that kind of shit. Yeah, we all grew up with that. And again, it's very deliberately cultivated to give you this idea of supremacy, which just when you start to dig into it, just simply melts away. That's the thing. And again, like I will repeat what I have said previously. And again, this is something that we are going to go into more when it comes to discussions of Gladio operations. Like the purpose of NATO, the purpose of the Gladio operations, and the purpose of the US presence in Europe was never about a Soviet invasion. That was, again, they knew very well, like the CIA and MI6 knew very well that the Soviets weren't planning to invade. Not in the Stalin period, not in the Khrushchev period, not in the Brezhnev period. It was never going to happen. What was true was that NATO and the US military occupation of Western Europe, which is essentially what it is there to make sure that there is no revolution in Western Europe. That's what US military occupation is really there to do. It's to make sure that all of the governments in Western Europe remain solidly on side and reliably anti-communist. And it's there to guarantee, and this is particularly true of the Gladio operations, that any revolution or attempted revolution by the working class will face immediate terrorist attacks by gangs of Gladio operatives who are mafia types, fascists, etc., all organized and put to work by NATO. So the purpose of NATO is not externally facing, it's internally facing, always was. And again, I'm currently doing some research. I found some invaluable resources on Soviet and Eastern Bloc Warsaw Pact militaries, and it's my view that even until probably the early 80s, even with the problems that the Soviet Union undoubtedly did have, even until the Gorbachev period, it's my view that the Soviet armed forces, people might take exception to this idea, but I'm going to do it. I'm going to go there anyway. It's my view that the Soviet armed forces and their associated allies in the Warsaw Pact were superior in terms of ultimately the practical applications of their military technology, and the military organization and fighting abilities of their armies were all superior to the imperialist armies. And had it come to it, it would have the Warsaw Pact, I think, could have won that war had it remained a conventional war. And after the Brezhnev period, and here's where I won't say I've reevaluated Brezhnev, but I think the Brezhnev period contains positives to it, which should be understood properly. And it contains negatives too. We should not sugarcoat this. But Brezhnev's expansion of the missile forces, of the strategic missile forces, Brezhnev's expansion of the nuclear deterrent that the Soviet Union possessed, undoubtedly gave the US pause for thought, because suddenly the Soviet Union was in a position where it could annihilate Western Europe and the United States. Excuse me. And that's, of course, causes a recalibration of thought. I also offer some praise to Brezhnev for doing the right thing over Prague in 1968. The intervention, I will say, of the Warsaw Pact forces led by the Soviets was requested by Czech communists because Dubček was a miserable pro-capitalist sellout, along with Ota Sik, his right-hand man, who was preparing to fully restore capitalism. He was planning to do what was done in 1989, and he was doing it 20 years earlier. and the Soviet military intervention in Czechoslovakia in 1968 was absolutely the right thing to do. Crushing that was the right thing to do, and I will go on record and debate that if necessary. But this is I digress slightly. But we have to be realistic about the Brezhnev period, and I think the Maoist and Hojarist denunciation of that intervention as social imperialist was wrong, completely wrong. So the other issue is, of course, that the Western armies, especially post-Vietnam, were suffering from like a morale collapse. So again, like they couldn't have managed an offensive campaign on the ground against the Soviet Union. They couldn't have done it. They were, and again, their industrial capacity was diminishing over time. Like the British industrial capacity was shrinking every year at least after about 1965, arguably earlier. French was to a slightly lesser degree. West German industrial capacity was better, but it was a divided country with a fairly weakened military. So most of the fighting would have fallen on the US. And could they have sustained a war in Europe? And in my view, no. It was all bluffing, you see. Everything that you see here about it's a great immortality of the Western militaries. It's all a bluff. It's all advertising, and it doesn't stand up to scrutiny, and it certainly couldn't have stood up to a war with the Warsaw Pact forces. Even in the later period, I don't think it could have done so. The real tragedy is that the political decay in the Soviet Party reached a point where men got elevated into positions who should never have been anywhere near them. Like Gorbachev shouldn't have had the honor of cleaning fucking toilets in Moscow. Never mind being the head of the CPSU. But the really tragic thing is that and again, this is my own view, that by 85, the West is in the middle of a series, or the beginning, I should say, of a series of fake booms, rapidly expanding bubbles and then bursting bubbles. We're straying into the economics of the thing now, but perhaps this is only natural. Like there was a crisis following the collapse in profitability, collapse in the rate of profit after 1965. You then get a series of attacks on the working class domestically in Britain and in the United States, which, of course, in our case, culminates in 85. You get a series of like short booms and slumps between like 85 and 92, growth from 92 to 97, and then again from 97 to about 2001, slow down after 2001, slow down again after 2005, total collapse in 2007. So inside, really, the 40 years from the decline of the post-war boom to the becoming obvious that there's a real worst ever crisis of overproduction by the mid-2000s, you see imperialism just on a relentless downward spiral, interspersed with brief booms that essentially act as a stock market sugar high. And again, the tragic thing is that this was clear if you were actually applying the lens of Marxism-Leninism in terms of analyzing the economics of imperialism. Unfortunately, too many people had stopped doing that in the USSR. Now, we are somewhat getting into disconnected territory here in this digression, but I will bring it back to Zelensky and the PR war. So all of this mythology, Western economic immortality, the West being the land of perpetual wealth, Western military supremacy. Again, you don't need to read too much history. You just need to read the real history of the 19th and 20th centuries in a basic military book to find out the reality of like how bad a lot of the Western armies perform when they're put up against a peer competitor. They can't compete. They can't do it. We go back again to Mao's statement about the West's fundamental weakness being their lack of connection with the masses, and this is where the weakness fundamentally comes from. It's where one of the areas the weakness comes from. The point is that when we get to the Ukraine war, the Ukrainian leadership, of course, can be discounted because they have essentially signed control of the war fully over to the NATO command, principally to the British and the United States officer corps, senior officers who are running the Ukraine war. Syrsky's job, I think, just as Zelensky's job was before him, was to basically manage and implement the plans that are decided in Washington and London. I do not think for a moment that either man has real operational control over the Ukrainian armed forces. I think they have like tactical control, but all the plans, like all the big plans, are dreamed up in Washington and London. Arguably for the Kursk incursion, it's London. Kit Clarenberg, who I'm hoping to have back on the show soon, has reported extensively on that. The point here is that the design of the war reflects the absolute hubris and people and the absolute hubris of British and American officers who are completely high on their own supply, absolutely high on their own supply. You look at the way that they have constructed the Ukrainian army. They've been trying desperately to break it out of its old Soviet habits. It's about the fact the Soviet military was superior in almost every way to the imperialist militaries. And they've been trying to teach it what they call maneuver warfare. Now, again, you don't have to go back too far and to find out where this comes from. I mean, this is one of the things that is valuable about Andrei Martyanov's books. I found anyway when reading them, the way he spells out where all these theories come from, and a lot of it comes straight from the Wehrmacht, like straight from the theories outlined by like Heinz Guderian, von Manstein, people like that, or the admiration of the Western officer corps for people like that old rat Erwin Rommel, who's always presented, by the way, as the good Nazi, this idea, or the anti-Nazi Wehrmacht officer, which no such thing ever really existed unless you count von Stauffenberg and the other unsuccessful would-be assassins of Hitler. Now, so a lot of this stuff, a lot of the so-called maneuver warfare, a lot of the obsession with like sudden rapid strikes does come from this, and again, a misunderstanding of the Wehrmacht's successes in especially like 39, 40, 41, basically. Success in 1939 against a poorly organized and poorly led politically Polish army. Which even von Manstein in his memoirs, which are worth reading, he reflected that the Polish officer corps made the wrong choice in terms of they kept trying to engage the Wehrmacht in open battles, in big open battles, which of course suited the German officers down to the ground. So even von Manstein reflects that they could have had a much more difficult time taking on the Poles had the Polish officers actually waged a more defensive campaign. They failed to do so and made it relatively easy for the Nazis. And again, this is all from von Manstein's own book. They also expected that the French and the British would launch a major offensive in the West, and as Manstein admits, they didn't have the forces to compete there, or to actually deal with that. Had the British and the French attacked when they were in the middle of the war against Poland, they weren't at the point yet where they could properly respond to it. But the British and the French obligingly gave them enough time to finish the Poles off before launching a tiny incursion into the west of Germany and then retreating again, and sitting there and waiting and hoping that the Nazis would just roll on straight into the Soviet Union, as we've covered many times before. So the success in Poland is mainly based on the fact that the Polish military command and the Polish politicians chose to fight the wrong type of war. The success in France was much, much less to do with the genius of the Wehrmacht than it was the fact that the two things happened. One, that the French military high command did not want to fight and made that absolutely obvious. The French senior officers viewed the real enemy for them as being the communists, being the domestic working class. And they were all old men who should have been forcibly retired years before anyway. The French government was politically divided and confused, and many of them were pro-fascist already. So the complete collapse of the French army in the face of the Blitzkrieg, the vaunted Blitzkrieg of early 1940, had a lot more to do with the fact that the French politically and military deliberately capitulated, and then those that did want to continue the fight were deposed in a fascist coup. So again, what happens there is not so much a triumph of German military planning and efficiency, such as it is a total, utter collapse of the French armed forces, a collapse from the top, a collapse which is orchestrated from the top down, culminating in a fascist coup. And then the French surrender when they've still got hundreds of thousands of men under arms, when they could still have defended, put up a better defense of most of the country. It says that a fascist coup comes in and deliberately surrenders, and a calculated act of capitulation, and the British leg it back across the sea. So again, you break down the supposed genius of the Wehrmacht, and it comes down really to being the victor in these two fights early on in the war, where their opponents obligingly disintegrated for them. Then, of course, we get into the matter of Operation Barbarossa. But before we do that, it should be noted that the Wehrmacht, for all their brutalities and the brutalities of their Croat fascist allies, and of course Bosniak fascist allies, and some Serb fascist allies in Yugoslavia, could not suppress or properly defeat, and ended up losing to the partisan movements there, Tito's in Yugoslavia itself, and then the Albanian forces led by Hoxha and others, which beat the Italian fascists and inflicted severe damage on the Germans. So that needs to be noted before we get to Barbarossa. But Barbarossa, I mean, was the operation that the Nazis threw absolutely everything at, in terms of men, machines, air power. Not only that, but they mobilized as much of the military and industrial capacity of occupied Europe as they possibly could to carry this out, and came close to taking Moscow, but ultimately they fail. And when the Soviets have weathered the storm, and when they are able to bring the full resources of the Soviet economy and the revolutionary people of the Soviet Union to bear upon the Nazis, the Nazis lose. Again, a horrific cost, but again the successful tactics in the early part of the war, the early part of the invasion of the Soviet Union, didn't ultimately bring them victory. So the Nazis ultimately were lucky in terms of the fact that they had their early war against two governments in the form of the Poles and the form of the French, who both of which had very large pro-fascist tendencies within them. One of whom was much more concerned about being rabidly anti-communist, that's the Poles, than they were about defending the country. And again, like that exiled Polish government showed repeated pro-fascist tendencies all the way through the war, perhaps carried out by a fascist coup plotter or fascist coup plotters. So this is what the great Wehrmacht reputation is based on. And so when it comes to the genius used to base their tactics off, it's no wonder Ukraine's in the mess that it is in. So going back to this idea of Western military supremacy, again, this is a confection. This is like a stick of candy floss. You try and bite into it, and there's no substance to it whatsoever. And again, what have they been trying to teach the Ukrainians? This amazing maneuver warfare that is supposedly going to make the Russians run away. Did they ever expect that would actually happen? I think some of them are so high on their own supply that they actually thought that the presence of Leopard tanks in Ukraine would cause the Russians to turn and run away. Well, it didn't work in 1941. It didn't work so it's not going to work now, is it? So these people are so high on their own supply. They have been fortunate enough to be cruising along on a gigantic amount of accumulated capital, accumulated through imperialist banditry over the last 200 years, coasting on victories that they didn't really win, coasting on myths that they created about them, and then trying to bring all these lessons that they think they've learned from the last 100 years of political, economic, and military history to bear in Ukraine, and they're finding that none of it is working. They're finding that the Russian army, for all the damage done to the Russian state and society by the pro-capitalist forces in Russia, is not only more than capable of taking on these NATO-trained forces, but manages to beat them every single time. And this isn't just because Ukraine lacks an air force, so that's part of it. It's also because the tactics themselves don't seem to be any good. Now, the one time this worked was essentially when the Russians carried out a strategic withdrawal from the Kharkov area, and then the Ukrainians rushed into Kursk and then lost, according to Russian estimates, 21,000 men killed, wounded, and captured over the last 2 months. So again, what was it that this was meant to do? And again, this is not only based on mythologies about Western military supremacy, it's also based on a fundamentally erroneous idea of what the Ukrainians are capable of, but also what the effect on the Russians will be of this great and amazing maneuver warfare, where it turns out the Russians just assess it, then calmly respond to it and take it to pieces. But in the PR war, the PR war that the West is waging, where Zelensky is the heroic guerrilla fighter dressed in green, he's there in a trench, not just being called an arsehole by the Azov guys. He's leading his amazing NATO-trained army in a war of maneuver against the orcs dug into their trenches in the east, and this is a great success. And victory will come any day now. And again, you put the NATO glasses on. They're like the Google glasses, but stream porn directly onto your eyeballs. You put the NATO glasses on, and you can see that if you are in their carefully curated reality. But then you go into the real world, and you find that most of these great and genius NATO organized offensives, like in Kursk last year, Kursk this year, like in Zaporozhye last year, have just ended with gigantic amounts of casualties. Yes, the Kursk incursion got further, but it achieved nothing militarily for Ukraine other than the loss of a load more of their trained men and a load more of their equipment. So again, this is all based on essentially a PR war, all based on faulty assumptions, all based on the idea that if they can just do some great maneuver, that surely, somehow, something will happen. That's what some of them will be thinking. Or surely, somehow, that the sanctions will kick in, or, and this is probably the most brutal, realistic appraisal, that if they can just keep providing fake victories to the Ukrainian population, then they will secure Zelensky's political position for another few months, which is what really the Kursk incursion was all about. 21,000 men killed, wounded, and captured. To do what? To make sure that Zelensky got some good headlines, in order basically to keep him in place. In order to do what? To keep the war going. Because as I've said many times before, all of this boils down to one thing, which is that the consensus in the West, when we come down to it, is all about just keeping the war going at the cost of hundreds of thousands of more dead. Then that's what they will do, which is why Zelensky will give way to Lindsey Graham's demand to recruit younger, to recruit as young as 18, to recruit probably younger than that. If they say they're going to go down to 18, then they'll be going lower than that. Trust me. They will be snatching up 16-year-olds to go to the war. I saw footage of Kharkov just the other day, 2 days ago, where you had literally the press gang men are stood on every street corner, waiting for any guy who looks like he's above the age of 15 to go past, then jumping on them and literally wrestling them off the street, throwing them in a van, giving them a gun, giving them a week's training or something. I mean, according to the interviews carried out with the Russians of captured men in the Kursk region, some of them were given not even 2 weeks training, literally taught how to point a gun and shoot it, then told, right, go off there and fight. And that's the horrible reality. And all cooked up in London and Washington by military officers whose heads are so filled with bullshit it's fountaining out of their ears. And here we are in the what might best be described as the beginning of the endgame of the Ukraine war, and they're still clinging on to these myths. They're still trying to find another way just to keep the war going. They're still finding poor bastards to go off and die in this thing. And I think when we start to break down the number of myths that helped create this war, we can see that we have something of a huge task ahead of us of deconstructing the edifice of Western supremacy, because it's really that needs to be taken to pieces. And those of us in the West have a key role to play in dismantling it before it gets many more people killed. All right, so we are 45 minutes in or so. It's time to take some comments. I know that this stream did have an earlier start. I apologize to anybody who tuned in earlier, but it was unavoidable delay. So hello to our Moscow time zone friends, Irish Partisan and Svetlana, who had to tune out. I hope you can catch up with the program tomorrow. So we have Yuan here with us, and we have Nehat, who joins us from Istanbul. We have Veshna Pamet, who's enjoying a Yugoslav song. Hello to John. Hello to Comrade Jawad. Hello to David King. Hello to Sir Parnassus Mang, who joins us. Hello to Robeson, who joins us from Indonesia. Hello to Morgan, who's joining us live after a couple of weeks in the Atlas Mountains. So good to have you with us. I went there myself all the way back in 2007. Beautiful place. Hello to Nasser, who joins us from Tottenham and greets all anti-imperialists. And I greet you back again. Hello to Nikki in Athens. And hello to Drunken Sailor, who says, Priyatelji. I don't know what that means, but I think it probably means hello. Pittsburgh Dude says, this music is also so awesome sober, I can't imagine how it would be after a few shots of vodka. Oh yeah, you'd be like singing your lungs out. You really would. Hello to Sid. Hello to Mutanda. Hello to Chris Casseroles. Hello to Aziz, joining us from the US vassal state of Australia. Hello to Francisco, who joins us from Mexico. Sid says, I have so many books, I am constantly finding new ones that I feel compelled to order and read. I'll have to start constructing my own shelves pretty soon. Yeah, it's the eternal curse of the Marxist. Abolish NATO joins us from New Jersey. Just a Maverick is with us. We got Almir here from Slovenia, Yugoslavia. Sid Hatfield says the imperialists' invincibility has never been true. They actually haven't won a major war on their own since 1898. That's the Spanish-American War. Hello to Jay Cav, who joins us from Scotland. Aziz says, Russia and Iran have proven that the US, NATO, Israel are paper tigers, indeed. Hello to Ruski Partisan, who is with us. Vishna Pamet says, the Euro-Atlantic plan to turn Bulgarians against Russia is failing in Bulgaria. Well, good. Greetings to Bart, who joins us from Ontario. Aziz says, given the Russian economy is booming after the sanctions, why couldn't Russia achieve the same results before the sanctions? It's a good question, Aziz, and the answer lies in the fact that the sanctions did the Russians a favor by doing two things. One, it forced the Russian government to adopt a model of stricter state control over key industries, and whereas the Russian government prior to 2014, and certainly prior to 2008, had only been cautiously moving towards doing that in the energy sector. 2014 forced the government to pick up the pace with regards to economic intervention and state management of key industries. The sanctions also forced the Russian capitalist class to carry out at least some investments inside Russia itself, and it stopped some, but by no means all, of the capital flight out of Russia. So it forced the Russian government to essentially adopt a heavily protectionist, more state interventionist model than had previously been possible for them to build. And that was because, prior to that, Putin's methods in his first 10 years in power relied heavily on moving slowly and by consensus, by what you might call an elite consensus. And because there was still represented in the Russian elite, which he was obliged to listen to because of the way he runs things, a comprador element that was viscerally opposed to all of these things, he was moving very cautiously in doing them. He should really thank the Americans for speeding that whole process up, because it finally put Russia where it needed to be, which was, well, not strictly where it needed to be, but in a much more advantageous position of actually having what is generally referred to in the academic literature as a developmentalist state, which is big barriers to entry of capital and the flight of capital. The protectionist measures being taken over certain sections of the Russian manufacturing, the forcible creation of import substitution. So the sanctions and the barring of the entry of Western goods into Russia forced a level of innovation directed by the Russian government to carry out comprehensive import substitution of the things they needed to produce domestically, or to get quite a few of them directly from the Chinese or directly from the Indians. But it forced a level of innovation with regard to import substitution as well. So the reason why they couldn't get the same results beforehand was because of essentially the crippling conservatism of the state structure in Russia, which was like Putin had been advised to go in this direction 20 years ago by some of the people he brought in with him, did advise this. But again, Putin's overriding concern was stability and moving inch by inch, piece by piece, trying to keep all the different factions at least on board to the point where they wouldn't be sponsoring open rebellion. Many of them will be sponsoring veiled rebellions or hidden rebellions. because I think there was a very real fear in that Putin held, that had he moved like this earlier, then the certain elements of the compradors would have tried to launch some kind of rebellion. I don't know if they had much support in the military, but they certainly had a lot of support in the intelligentsia. Certainly they can carry out a lot of destabilization. Certainly there were other assets that the US and the British had that they could have deployed 20 years ago if the Russians if the Russian government had moved quicker. So I think all of those reasons are in play, and I hope that answers your question. Greetings to Alex in Sao Paulo, Brazil. Let's have a look through the comments here. Good evening to Comrade Jason, who joins us from a damp Essex. Good evening to Stig Pedersen, who joins us from a state of delusion called Denmark. Well, that's all of Western Europe for you, mate, really. Nush82 asks, has the situation in Ukraine weakened the support for comprador elements in Moldova? Well, it certainly appears that it weakened it inside Moldova itself. But again, like those Moldovan elections recently just seem completely fucking rigged. Suddenly the entire overseas vote comes in, the exile vote, the emigre vote, and it all goes to the pro-EU side. Don't believe that. Something's very dodgy there. Almir says, just a few weeks ago, US Congress voted in 25 new anti-China laws in 1 week, billions of US dollars for anti-China propaganda. Soft power is very important for the imperialists. Indeed it is. Perception management is vital for them, and especially since the decline of organized religion. Sid Hatfield says, as an undergrad in 2005, there was a girl in my class who had just returned from Ukraine who seemed guarded when asked why she was there. In retrospect, I'll bet she partook in the Orange Revolution. Was she from Ukraine, or was she an American who went to work in Ukraine? Because I bet I ran into people back then who probably did as well. We're surprised to see nearly 35% in Transnistria voting for the pro-Euro faction in Moldovan elections. Well, I mean, Transnistria, and again, I haven't researched as much into this as I would like, but I think that there are a lot of problems in Transnistria, which the pro-EU propagandists can exploit. Remember, the EU propagandists literally say that the EU is a paradise, that it will solve every single problem, that it will solve corruption, that it will solve the problem of low economic growth, despite the fact the EU's own collective growth is tiny and stagnating these days, that it'll solve the problem of cultural backwardness, of lack of education, any problem that you've got, especially in countries which have had these problems for a long time. The propagandists of the EU will go there and tell you that joining the EU is the magic bullet. You join the EU, all of this goes away. All of these problems end. And so people who are frustrated and angry in Moldova or Transnistria, or anywhere else, or in Ukraine, following years of stagnation and decay, will start to believe anything, especially if it's sold relentlessly and sold with skill by well put together advertising campaigns. So that's probably one reason why you've got that kind of vote level. Almir says, since the Red Army truly came into its own in 1943 after Stalingrad, West never really had military superiority. Yes, which is why their only plan was for the bomb. Nehat says, Crimean War is called World War Zero by Russians. I agree. It is the war nobles sold his invented weapons to kill mass people on the Turkish side. England supported Ottoman Empire despite the cultural differences. The Russians thought our non-Muslim empire is a vanguard for civilization, whereas English realized there should be no other society scientific enough to challenge them, says Nehat. Sid says, and the partisan forces all over Europe who resisted occupation also did the bulk of the fighting with the Russians and the Chinese. Yes, all led by communists, of course. Albert says, the old boy at my social club was in the Royal Signals in the Falklands War. He told me that the Argentines just had to hold out for another 2 weeks to win. Yes, I've heard that before. I'm going to have to look further into the Malvinas issue. Nehat says, Ottoman Empire was so weakened at the end that they had no choice to accept English help. Russians were surprised because they thought fellow Christians were pro-progress. Well, they were not. Whereas one need to understand that the Ottoman Empire was the only symbol for non-Christian people to be able to exist, and they failed. Well, yes, I mean the belief that Christianity is or shared Christian faith means anything was rather naive. Religion means nothing to the English bourgeois, I should say. The English bourgeois will be very much in favor of Christian solidarity if he's up against atheists, and he'll weep for the fate of Christians if they want to make propaganda that's anti-Bolshevik. But they're the least religious people in the world, or at least they bend. I think the better way to say it would be that the English ruling class bend their Christianity around whatever it is that they need to have it bent around. So, it's the reason why there was so many batshit crazy, like, Christian cults in the bourgeois that were linked to imperialism, because, like, English bourgeois Christianity had to be wrapped up with an awful lot of empire worship, and that's certainly what went on back then, and still goes on to this day to a certain extent. Okay, going through the comments here. Rupert says the only reason the Americans invaded Europe in World War II was to stop Stalin from taking everything. Yes, because with the support of the partisan movement, the Soviets could have gone all the way to the coast. And then you would have got a Europe of people's democracies, basically, shaped by the communists. I mean, this is the real reason why they did D-Day. The real reason they opened the Second Front was because they knew very well that the Nazis were getting caned, and if they didn't move quickly, that they'd end up with not Soviet occupation of all of these countries, but Soviet liberation of them, and then the coming to power probably of communist-led governments in all of Europe. Almir agrees that the Soviet bloc was militarily superior. Sid says the Red Army would likely always had a morale and motivation advantage over the NATO armies. Western armies ran into poor morale in 1921, as reported in most US papers. Yeah, the intervention against the Soviet Union, or the Soviet Russia as it was in the late 1900s, early 1920s, part of the reason why it collapsed was because the armies that they were deploying just didn't want to fight anymore. Nurshady2 says Soviet military doctrine seems to remained as a primarily defensive one until the mid-80s. They did not build a single aircraft carrier. No, because they weren't about projecting power away from the Soviet Union. It was about defending the Soviet homeland and also the Warsaw Pact. It wasn't about sending an aircraft carrier down to, I don't know, the middle of the Indian Ocean so you could bomb some African country or intimidate somebody. That wasn't what Soviet military power was used for. Almir says NATO military doctrine for conventional war is almost entirely based on the Wehrmacht. It was on full display in the catastrophe that was the big Ukrainian counteroffensive in 2023. Yes, exactly. Albert makes the interesting and correct observation that Western so-called communists were burning their party cards in protest against Czechoslovak intervention. Selective outrage. Blair was voted for another term after mass murder in Iraq. Well, look, I mean, look at all those fucking bozos who left in the Communist Party after 1956. Well, I mean, admittedly, there was more. There was more going on in '56 than just the Hungarian fascist uprising, again fueled by Western intelligence services. But they, again, like Khrushchev, under pressure from the revolutionary section of the party and under pressure from international communists such as Mao, made the right decision in crushing that. Absolutely the right decision. But the weaklings in the British Communist Party wavered all over the place, and a load of their sort of more opportunist wings left, and some of them joined the Trotskyites, and the Trotskyites wrote whole books about how there were workers' councils operating in Hungary, which is what the Trots say about every counter-revolution that's ever existed. There's always a workers' council somewhere that a Trotskyite has found, but strangely enough, it's always fascists that are in the leadership. But there you go. Look up Operation Shield. That's Warsaw Pact Power. Thanks, Vishna Pamet, for the suggestion there. I'll take a look at that. '81, '82. Almir says Brezhnev was okay. I always kind of liked him. I mean, he gets a bad reputation. And let's not beat around the bush here. There were things going on in that Brezhnev period which were not good. The continued pro-capitalist reforms in so-called reforms, counter-reforms in certain areas, the growth of pro-capitalist tendencies, all the elevation of the layer of opportunists that ultimately destroyed the Soviet Union happened in this time. I mean, Brezhnev, it is argued that he carried on too long. And there was always arguments about his state of health in after about 77, 78. But you then have to go back to when he became general secretary. I mean, the displacement of Khrushchev was undoubtedly a good thing. Khrushchev was ultimately accused of doing all the things that he actually accused Stalin of, such as insulting and demeaning his fellow leaders and trying to build a cult of personality around himself. Khrushchev did all those things. Brezhnev's time was marked by a return to a collective leadership. Khrushchev did attempt to rule, if not solo, then certainly with a very small clique around him, as did Gorbachev. Again, the Brezhnev period is an odd one because it is a return to collective leadership. There were some positives that occurred during that time. It's called a time of stagnation, and yes, I think there is a certain degree to which that is true. But again, I think we should ask more questions about this because there was undoubtedly another tendency going on in the Brezhnev period, which was that the certain aspects of the revolutionary line, the revolutionary faction in the Soviet Party were getting stronger. There was the demonization of Stalin done by Khrushchev was officially stopped in the Brezhnev period. Now they didn't do the right thing, which would have been to overturn the secret speech completely and call Khrushchev the liar that he was. So they didn't do that, but they didn't go any further with it. So all of that stopped after the removal of Khrushchev. It stopped for 20 years until Gorbachev comes along. And then you get the renewed assault on the Stalin period with Gorbachev. But in the Brezhnev, it stops. There's even a story that I read, I mean, I don't know how true this is, that under Andropov and then certainly under the brief reign of Konstantin Chernenko, that there was a plan to fully rehabilitate Stalin that was in the works. I've yet to see any real evidence of that other than a couple of articles on the I think it's the Russo site, Well, certainly there was a lot of different tendencies in that Brezhnev period, reflecting a lot of different factions in the Soviet Party. I think it deserves to be remembered, or certainly reflected upon more critically, and it doesn't deserve to be remembered as just wholly negative. And even though it must be said that the collective leadership during that time made a series of mistakes, they continued the pro-capitalist path in certain areas, but there were also countervailing tendencies there. So it needs to be analysed properly. I may even read. I think Brezhnev wrote memoirs, so it may be worth reading those at some point. NATO could never mobilize forces like the Warsaw Pact could, particularly in the early 80s, says Veshna Pamet. Andromeda Star says Brezhnev was the best of the post-Stalin leaders. That's true. Not a lot of competition there, though, in some respects. Nightly Devilish says Stalin should not have recognized Israel. Marxism, Leninism, and the Soviet Union should never have had an anti-Islamic beliefs. I'm not sure what you mean about anti-Islamic beliefs. And now, and this Stalin recognized Israel thing, the Soviet Union, and again, remember, Stalin is part of a collective leadership, made a decision to vote for the partition plan. Now, you can argue that that was a mistake, but what they were voting for was the creation of the much vaunted two-state solution. Now, that was not done due to the machinations of the Zionists and the imperialists. So the Zionists and the imperialists created the state of Israel and would have created it whether the Soviet Union voted for that plan or not. There's some ultra-lefts running around out there at the moment on the internet saying that it's Stalin's fault and the Soviet Union's fault that Israel was created. This is utter garbage. Like it was a project of imperialism created by imperialism. Now the Soviet Union voted for that partition plan. You can argue that that was a mistake, but to say that this created Israel is nonsense. And as for this, Soviet Union should never have had anti-Islamic beliefs. The Soviet Union was not anti-religion per se, but they insisted on a strict secularism within society. People could be Muslim, people could be Christian, people could be Buddhist, and indeed millions were in the Soviet Union. But this idea that they were uniquely anti-Islamic is as nonsense as there's to say that they were uniquely anti-Christian or anti-Jewish or anti-Buddhist. Religion could be freely practiced in the Soviet Union. Millions did. What you weren't free to do, and this is quite right, is hide anti-state conspiracies in a church or in a temple or in a mosque. You weren't free to do that. So I completely disagree with your entire statement. Just scrolling through some more comments here. Sid Hatfield says, Western military planners were heavily influenced by the Prussian military schools. General Fritz Kramer was the number 3 man at the Pentagon for all those years. Surprise, surprise. Nurshady2 says, Ukrainian mercenary videos everywhere complaining about Ukrainian military doctrine being too bureaucratic. They wanted to go in NATO Rambo style. Well, NATO style doesn't exist. Like, this is the nonsense. Like, it's like so much of what you find about the image of the West, not just in the military sense, but in other senses as well, is like so much of it is like based on films. It's based on like fictions. Not just fictions created by propagandists, but literal fiction. Like, Sly, you think that people think they're fucking Sly Stallone running in there going, they call me baby killer, they're spitting at me. Like he's, like having a meltdown with Richard Crenna, having been targeted by Brian Dennehy. This is, again, like so much of are the myths here are just literally like stuff that comes out of the cinema or off television. I mean, it really is like the replacement for religion. Right. Just going through the comments here. If anybody's got a link to that Warsaw Pact operation or a link to the reference, please post it in the comments because I'd like to take a look at that as well. Vishna Pamit says there was a Bulgarian General Stoichev allowed to march in Red Square Victory Parade in 1945. Interesting. Hello to Random 789. Thank you for the compliment there. Vishna Pamit says the Ukrainians are so corrupt they make new units just to give commanders a job for the boys while neglecting other units. Yeah, I mean, the fact is, if the Russians had gone harder in terms of their attacks, I think much more of the Ukrainian defensive line would have collapsed. Rupert says there is still an anti-Slav racism in the Western ruling class. Well, that's true. There's a lot of racism in the Western ruling class. Edward says, insane that the Polish bourgeoisie was willing to have better the Nazis to rule Poland than the communists. There's also, as long as centers of capitalist power exist, bourgeois tendencies will appear. That's true. Crowfeather is enjoying the content now that you are listening more often. Well, good to have you with us. So Sid says, to answer the question, it was the American who went to Ukraine. Interesting. Morgan says, the established media word of the day is pivotal with regard to the Georgian election. Tomorrow it will be stolen. Yeah. I mean, I think that the Georgian Dream will probably win. I mean, by no means an organization that I would cherish voting for, but the pro-EU side in Georgia is so fucking bad. It makes your head spin. It really is. Terrible people. Really is. By the way, I did watch some of the Trump-Rogan interview. One of the funniest things I've ever seen. It's like, I mean, I'm not going to spend too much time commenting on this. It's a bit of a joke, but it's like a guy spends like the first part of the interview like talking like what he is, which is a New York real estate guy describing what he likes about the fixtures and fittings in the White House. It's like, or how great his ratings were, because that's still the two things that mean the most to him: real estate and TV. And so I found the whole thing just fucking tedious. See, Tim Dillon's done an interview with J.D. Vance. Like, I'm almost tempted to watch that. Just to see if he'll. I hope he tries to get Vance to talk about Epstein's Island. That would be funny. Will the West go to World War III before conceding? No, they can't. They don't have the capacity to do it. The Americans are now deterred from striking at Iran. There's no two ways about it. Sid says, not to defend Khrushchev, but I'm not certain that his secret speech ever really took place. The whole text of that speech was procured and brought to the West by none other than Reinhard Gehlen. I'm afraid it did. I mean, the text and the supporting documents have been obtained from the Soviet archives by Grover Furr in his work Khrushchev Lied. There's been accounts written of the reaction by people who were there in the hall when Khrushchev gave the speech. There's the reflections of Molotov in his sort of semi-biography about the speech. So it happened. I mean, maybe I don't know. I didn't know about Galen being involved in bringing it to the West, but that speech happened. It really did. Molotov reflects upon it. Kaganovich later, who two men who lived a very long time, reflected upon it in later writings. The attempt at de-Stalinization, so-called, did happen. The removal of Stalin from the mausoleum and his burying in a simple grave, which maybe would have appealed to him anyway, I don't know. But the denigration of Stalin did happen. And again, like the people who knew about what was going on, such as Mao and others and Hoxha, saw the speech. I maybe didn't see it directly, but like certainly saw the full text of it, and reacted later accordingly. And also, it was used as a jumping off point to, again, it wasn't just the speech, it was the changing of Soviet policy that was going on at the time to promote milk and water pacifism rather than internationalism, certainly in the West, to take the revolutionary content out of certainly the Western communist parties, to pursue so-called peaceful coexistence at all costs. So this speech did happen. Not only the speech happened, but the change in line happened within the CPSU. And again, like you read Grover Furr's books, he's got hold of it all. He's not only got hold of, thanks to his Russian researchers, I think, he's not only got hold of the speech, he's got hold of the records and the so-called research by people like, I think the guy who wrote it was called Popeslov. The supporting materials there in the archives, the full speech is in the archives. This happened. And if it would be one thing if this was a reported event that didn't match up with changes in the policy and the line pursued by the CPSU, but it did match up with a more reactionary pro-capitalist line being pursued in the CPSU by Khrushchev, who followed up on that speech with those actions. So whereas I would love to say that it was all just a plot by Reinhard Gehlen and the CIA, no. They exploited it, but they exploited an opening given to them by Khrushchev. Right, okay. Yeah, I mean, Furr's work is the best on this subject. It's pretty much unrivaled because he is a serious, very serious historian who literally just goes where the documented evidence leads him in all of his books. And I would say, I mean, I've read back to back like Furr's work and Lizardo's on Stalin. Furr's work is better. It's better. I was a bit unconvinced. I mean, Lizardo might be Lizardo's work on Stalin is probably a little bit easier to get into, but again, like I mean, I'm going to have to do a proper review of the Lizardo book. I didn't think it was as good as everybody was saying, to be blunt. I think it's useful in certain aspects of it, but I've read a lot of that stuff that Lizardo brings up, but better written about and with better evidence presented elsewhere. So I would say Furr's work is better. I would say Hapal Bra's work is better. I would say that Ludo Martin's work is better than Lizardo's. I find Lizardo makes far too many concessions to anti-Stalin points of view, and gives credence to things like the Katyn massacre, which again you can dig into You can dig into Goebbels' own diary to find contradictions about the official story there. So I would say my view is Lazzardo's work is overrated on that. I read it and just basically reached the end and thought, I've read that done. I've read better and more comprehensive arguments done elsewhere by communists with less grandiose reputations, but whose work is much better. Harry says, Khrushchev lied was great but very dry. First couple of times I tried to read it, I did find it dry. Then I went back to it again a while back, and I got through it really quickly. Because, again, it's written in this very academic style, which is what he's doing is he's basically conducting an exhaustive footnote and source review. So he tracks down like all of these different incidents that Khrushchev and Pepeslov, who wrote the speech apparently, put into the secret speech. And he tracks them down and he finds the references and he reveals that, all the occasions upon which Khrushchev lied and misrepresented events and conflated things. And he lays it out bit by bit by bit. And I think the first two times I read this, I didn't appreciate what he was doing, Grover was doing. But then when you think about it more and you think about the way in which these lies have become unquestioned, like you do need that. You do need that comprehensive academic demolition of, the Khrushchev speech, of Kotkin and others. So, and Kotkin and Snyder, who, the two modern day so-called historians and in reality propagandists, of things like Katyn, which again, when you dive into it, is like clearly something that was done by the Nazis, but was admitted to by the Gorbachev the treacherous Gorbachev clique as a means of improving relations with the Poles, and admitted to again by the Russian government led by Medvedev and Putin as a means of improving relations with the West. Didn't that work out well? Right, okay. So here we are. I'm going to bring things to a close for this evening. We have a couple of potential ideas coming out of the discussion tonight, which is Warsaw Pact versus NATO military doctrines and potential supremacy, i.e. who would win. So we may be looking at that. So we'll have I'll have to look into that, and I've got some good sources to use on that particular subject. So thanks to everybody who's tuned in tonight. Thanks to everybody who supports the show on Patreon. With the return of the Patreon audio stream kicks off this week, probably Tuesday. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do some Patreon streams, audio streams, where I basically catch up with things that I should have done a while ago. So I'm going to do the American crime classics on an audio stream, the Oliver Stone movies, JFK and Nixon reviewed, and I'm going to review the James Ellroy trilogy on the Kennedy assassinations and the Nixon period. And I'm also going to tackle some Q&A stuff on there as well. So thanks to everybody who supports the show on Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee. Audio uploads resume tomorrow. I'll be back again with you tomorrow evening. But until then, I will bid you good evening and wish you all a good rest of the weekend.